What happens when a man has nothing left to lose but his shame? 300 Spartans marched to Thermopylae. Only one walked back alive, and the world never let him forget it. No hero's welcome, no glory, just a name branded onto him like a scar, the Trembler. His neighbors wouldn't speak to him, wouldn't share their fire, looked straight through him like he was already a corpse. And in Sparta, that was the point, because surviving the wrong battle wasn't just disgraceful. It was a punishment designed to be worse than death. So he endured it. Every cold morning, every silent meal. Every ghost of a man he used to be reflected back at him in the eyes of warriors who had nothing but contempt for the fact that he was still breathing. For a year, and then came Plataea, the battle that would decide the fate of the entire Greek world. And he made a decision. He stepped out of the Spartan line, raised his spear, and charged the Persian army alone. Not for Sparta, not for Greece, for the only thing he had left to fight for, the right to finally be remembered as something other than a coward. This is his story, and it is brutal. Picture the road home from the hot gates. It is 480 BC. The summer heat still clings to the hills of central Greece like a fever that won't break. The pass at Thermopylae is behind you now, that narrow throat of rock and sea where 300 of the most terrifying soldiers who ever lived made their stand against an empire so vast it blotted out the sun. You can still smell it if you try. The iron stink of blood baked into stone, the sweet rot of thousands of bodies in the august heat, the smoke from the fires the Persians lit to burn their own dead because there were simply too many to count. You walked away from all of that. You are alive. And you already know, deep in the marrow of your bones, in that cold animal place beneath all rational thought, that being alive is the worst thing that could have possibly happened to you. His name was Aristodemus, and the walk home to Sparta was, in every way that matters, the longest journey a human being has ever taken. Let's back up. Because to understand what Aristodemus was walking into, you have to understand what he was walking away from, and you have to understand the world that built him. Sparta was not a city in the way we think of cities. It wasn't a place you lived, so much as a force that consumed you from birth. The Spartans themselves called it Lacedaemon, and the people who lived there were shaped deliberately, systematically, almost surgically, into instruments of war. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and fed into the agoge, a state-run educational program that makes the phrase military school sound like summer camp. They slept on rushes, they cut themselves with their bare hands. They were deliberately underfed so they'd learn to steal food, and beaten if they got caught, not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. They fought each other. They were exposed to cold, to pain, to exhaustion, to humiliation. Every single day, by the time a Spartan man emerged from the agoge, he was not merely a soldier. He was a philosophy made flesh, a walking argument about what human beings could endure. And the centerpiece of that philosophy, the load-bearing wall of the entire Spartan worldview, was a concept so simple it barely needs explaining, and yet so radical it shaped the entire ancient world. Kalos Thanatos, the beautiful death. To die in battle, fighting for Sparta, surrounded by your brothers, holding the line, this was not merely acceptable. It was the point. It was the entire purpose of a Spartan life distilled into a single, final, glorious moment. Spartan mothers famously sent their sons off to war with the words, "Come back with your shield or on it." This wasn't poetic. It was instruction. return victorious or return dead. Those were the only two options a Spartan life offered. Everything else was a category error. The 300 men who marched to Thermopylae under King Leonidas understood this completely. More than that, they had been selected for this mission partly because they were older men with living sons, men whose family lines would continue even if they did not. They marched into that pass knowing, on some level, that they were not coming back. The oracle at Delphi had been pretty clear on the subject. Either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas had made his choice before the first Persian arrow was ever fired. What followed at Thermopylae over 3 days in late summer is one of the most extraordinary military engagements in human history. 300 Spartans, alongside perhaps 7,000 Greek allies, held a pass so narrow that the Persians' overwhelming numerical advantage. Estimates of the Persian force range from 200,000 to over 1 million, depending on which ancient source you trust and how generous you're feeling, became almost irrelevant. The geography did the work. The pass funneled the Persians into a killing ground where Greek discipline and bronze could meet them at something approaching equal terms. For 2 days, the Greeks held. Xerxes, the Persian king, watched wave after wave of his finest soldiers, the Medes, the Scythians, his own immortals, the legendary 10,000, crash against the Spartan phalanx and break like water on rock. He reportedly tore his robes in frustration. He sent messengers demanding the Greeks lay down their weapons. Leonidas sent back the famous reply, "Molon labe, come and take them." Then, on the 3rd day, a Greek traitor named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that bypassed the pass entirely. The flanking force arrived at dawn. Leonidas sent most of the Greek allies away. Whether they were dismissed to save them or simply chose to leave is a debate historians still argue, and the 300 Spartans, along with a handful of Thespians and Thebans who chose to stay, prepared for their last stand. They knew what was coming. They ate breakfast. They combed their hair, a Spartan ritual before battle, one of those details that hits you in the chest every time you think about it. And then they went forward, away from the wall they'd been defending, out into the open, to die on their feet and take as many Persians with them as they possibly could. Leonidas fell. The men who could still stand formed a circle around his body and fought until they were buried under arrows. It was, by any measure, a kalos thanatos, the most beautiful of beautiful deaths. And for the next 2,500 years, the world has never stopped talking about it. Aristodemus wasn't there for the end. Here is what the ancient sources, primarily Herodotus, tell us. Before the final battle, Leonidas dispatched 2 Spartan soldiers, Aristodemus and a man named Eurytus, back from the front. Both men were suffering from a severe eye infection, something Herodotus describes as causing temporary blindness. The condition was genuine. The medical excuse was real. Leonidas himself sent them away. But here is where the story fractures into something more complicated and more human. Eurytus, upon hearing that the Persians had completed their encirclement, ordered his helot servant to lead him to the fighting. Blind, barely able to stand, he went back into the pass and died with his brothers. Aristodemus did not. Herodotus is careful not to condemn him outright. He notes that another man, Pantites, had also survived, sent as a messenger to Thessaly before the battle ended, and that Pantites, upon returning to Sparta and finding what awaited him, hanged himself. Aristodemus, apparently, did not take that option. He walked home. He faced it. Imagine that walk, every mile of the road south towards Sparta, the story racing ahead of him. Word traveled fast in ancient Greece. Travelers, refugees, soldiers from the allied contingents who had been dismissed, they were all spreading the news. The 300 were dead. Leonidas had fallen, the hot gates had been taken, Greece itself was now wide open to the Persian army, and Xerxes was marching on Athens. And somewhere in that flood of news and grief and panic, there was a Spartan walking home, alive. By the time Aristodemus reached the outskirts of Sparta, they already knew his name. Think for a moment about what the fall of the 300 meant to Sparta as a community. These weren't abstract soldiers, they were fathers, brothers, sons. They were men the whole city had watched grow up, had trained alongside, had eaten with in the common mess halls called the Syssitia, where Spartan men took all their meals communally. 300 individual griefs, 300 empty places at the table, 300 women who were now widows or daughters without fathers. And then, walking through the gate, one man who should have been among them. The silence that must have greeted Aristodemus is almost impossible to imagine. Not the angry silence of a crowd working itself toward violence. Something worse. The silence of communal decision, of a society that had already, collectively, made up its mind about what he was and what he deserved, and had agreed without needing to discuss it on the punishment. Ostracism would be too soft a word, exclusion too mild. What the Spartans practiced on men who had failed the ultimate test had a formal name, atirmia, dishonor, loss of civic status. And it was applied to Aristodemus with a completeness and a creativity that reveals just how sophisticated the Spartan system of social control really was. His neighbors would not speak to him, not in anger. Anger would have been almost a relief, a form of engagement. They simply refused to acknowledge his existence. He became, socially, a non-person. If he greeted someone on the road, they looked through him. If he entered a room, conversations continued as though he were furniture. Yet he was given a name that would follow him for the rest of his life, stamped onto him like a brand. Aristodemus ho Tressus. Aristodemus the Trembler. In Spartan culture, this was perhaps the most devastating label a man could carry. The Trizantes, the Tremblers, were men who had flinched. Men whose bodies had, at the critical moment, chosen life over the phalanx. The word itself is almost onomatopoeic in Greek, carrying within it the suggestion of shaking, of weakness, of a body betraying the will. To be called a trembler was to have your entire identity collapsed into a single moment of perceived cowardice, to be defined forever by what you didn't do rather than everything you had done before. And here is the particular cruelty of Aristodemus's situation. He hadn't run, he hadn't thrown down his shield and fled, he had been sent away by Leonidas himself. His illness was real. The records, insofar as we have them, suggest that even Herodotus, who was not always kind to people he considered cowards, doesn't quite call Aristodemus a coward in so many words. He is careful. He notes the circumstances. He seems, across 2,500 years, almost uncomfortable with the verdict that Sparta rendered. But Sparta didn't traffic in nuance. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Eurytus had the same illness. Eurytus had gone back and died. Therefore, the illness was not the reason. Therefore, the reason was something else, something internal, something that made Aristodemus less than a Spartan in the only way that counted. He had, when it came to it, chosen to live, and now he would have to live with that. There is a particular quality to the kind of suffering Aristodemus was enduring that modern psychology has spent a great deal of time trying to name and understand. We call it survivor's guilt, and we know now that it is a genuine, measurable neurological experience, a rewiring of the brain's reward and threat systems that can render ordinary life almost unbearable. The survivor experiences not relief at their escape, but rather a deep, persistent sense of wrongness, a cognitive dissonance between the fact of their survival and the conviction that they do not deserve it. The faces of the dead crowd in. The question, why me and not them, loops without resolution. Aristodemus was experiencing this in its rawest possible form. And on top of that neurological reality, the Spartans had constructed a social architecture specifically designed to make his daily life a reinforcement of his shame. Consider what atimia meant in practical terms. In most ancient Greek societies, being denied civic honor meant losing political rights, the right to vote in assemblies, to hold public office, to participate in legal proceedings. Unpleasant, certainly. Humiliating, yes, but survivable in the sense that you could still conduct the basic business of living. You could still buy food in the market. People would still transact with you. You existed in a diminished but still functional social register. In Sparta, it went further. Much further. The refusal to give fire is the detail that gets me every time I read it. In the ancient world, fire was not a metaphor. It was survival, heating food, warming a home, light in the darkness. Fire was infrastructure in the most basic possible sense. And Aristodemus's neighbors, according to our sources, would not share it with him. They would not give him coals from their hearths, would not let him light a torch from their flames. It was a symbolic exclusion, yes, a way of saying you are cold, you are dark, you are outside the warmth of the community. But it also had genuine practical consequences. It was deprivation weaponized as social punishment. Then there was the matter of the agoj itself, the brotherhood of men who had trained together since childhood, who had slept in the same barracks, stolen food side by side, bled into the same dust during training exercises. The syssitia, the common mess where Spartan men ate every evening, was the heartbeat of Spartan social life. It was where friendships were maintained, where information was exchanged, where a man's status in the community was constantly, subtly negotiated through who sat near whom, who laughed at whose jokes, who sought whose counsel. Aristodemus could not eat there anymore. Or rather, the historical record suggests he was not formally expelled, because atimia wasn't necessarily a legal proceeding. It was something more total and more insidious than law. It was consensus. If every man in the mess hall turned his back when Aristodemus sat down, if every conversation stopped and every face went deliberately blank, if the table that had 10 men at it somehow had no room for an 11th, you didn't need a law. You didn't need a trial. The message was communicated with a precision that made formal punishment look almost merciful. Because formal punishment has an end. A trial has a verdict. A sentence has a completion date. What the Spartans were doing to Aristodemus had no scheduled conclusion. It would continue until he redeemed himself through combat, or until he died, at which point it would simply stop mattering. And this is where the psychological machinery becomes genuinely diabolical in its elegance. The Spartan system of shame was not designed merely to punish. It was designed to produce a specific outcome. The Trasantes were not cast out of Spartan society in a way that allowed them to leave, to go somewhere else, to start over. They were kept inside it, stripped of status, surrounded by men who had everything they used to have, constantly reminded of what they'd lost and what they would have to do to get it back. The system was designed to be so unbearable that the only rational response was to seek the first available opportunity to die gloriously in battle. It was psychological engineering toward a predetermined end, and it was ruthless. Now add to this the particular weight of who Aristodemus had survived. Not anonymous soldiers. The 300. Leonidas. Men who were already becoming legend within months of their deaths. The Greeks who had watched from a distance. The Phocians, the Corinthians, the Athenians were already telling the story. Simonides of Chios was already composing the epitaph that would be carved into stone at the pass itself. The one that every Western schoolchild has read in one form or another. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. These men were becoming immortal. Their names were being etched, literally and figuratively, into the permanent record of human history. And Aristodemus had been there. He had trained with them. He had eaten with some of them, fought beside others in earlier campaigns, grown up alongside the youngest ones in the agoge. He knew their faces, he knew their habits. He knew which ones snored and which ones woke before dawn, and which ones the night before a battle grew quiet and private in the way that men do when they are making peace with what's coming. And they were eternal now. And he was a ghost. There is a specific kind of madness that comes from being surrounded by the monuments to people whose deaths you did not share. Every conversation in Sparta was about Thermopylae now. Every woman who was widowed, every child who was fatherless, every old man whose son lay in the hot gates, they all moved through the same city as Aristodemus. They all radiated their grief like heat. And every one of them, in their grief, was also a monument to his failure. A living reminder of the choice that Eurytus had made and that Aristodemus had not. He would have replayed it, over and over, the way traumatized minds do. The moment when the news arrived that the Persians had flanked them. The moment when Eurytus called for his helot and was led back toward the fighting. The moment when Aristodemus didn't. Whatever that moment was, whatever passed through his mind in that instant, fear, paralysis, a desperate animal clinging to life, or perhaps something more complicated, a genuine inability to move that he himself couldn't explain, he would have examined it in obsessive detail every waking hour and in every dream. Was I afraid? Was I truly sick? Could I have gone back? Would it have mattered if I had? These questions have no bottom. You can fall into them forever. And all the while, outside Aristodemus's window, metaphorically speaking, since Spartan men didn't really have the luxury of private brooding, the world was changing fast. Because here is the thing that history sometimes lets us forget in our focus on individual human stories. The Persian War was not over, not even close. Thermopylae had been a defeat, a glorious, legendary, world-historical defeat. But a defeat. Xerxes and his army had walked through the pass and kept marching. They had swept down through Boeotia into Attica. The Athenians, reading the oracle's warning about a wooden wall as advice to put their faith in their fleet, had evacuated the city and watched from their ships as the Persians burned the Acropolis. The sacred buildings on that rocky height, including the older temples that preceded the Parthenon, went up in smoke. It was an act of calculated desecration, a message from Xerxes to every Greek who still held out hope. Your gods cannot help you, nothing can help you. But something strange was happening at sea. At Salamis, in the narrow straits between the island of that name and the Athenian mainland, the Athenian general Themistocles had maneuvered the Persian fleet into exactly the kind of confined space where their numbers became a liability rather than an asset. The Greek triremes, faster and more maneuverable, turned the battle into a catastrophic Persian rout. Xerxes, who had set up a throne on a hillside to watch what he expected to be the destruction of the Greek fleet, instead watched his navy get torn apart. He left Greece shortly after, taking a large part of his army with him, reportedly worried about a potential revolt back in Persia and about the security of his bridge of boats across the Hellespont. But he left behind a substantial force under his general Mardonius. Possibly 300,000 men, possibly less. The ancient sources argue endlessly, with orders to finish the conquest of Greece on land. Mardonius was talented, experienced, and he had spent the winter in Thessaly making alliances with Greek states that had Medicized, that is, submitted to Persia, including Thebes and its Boeotian neighbors. Come spring of 479 BC, he was ready to march again. The Greeks knew what was coming. Sparta knew what was coming, and in Sparta, among the men who were preparing to meet Mardonius, in what everyone understood would be the decisive land battle of the entire war, there was a man who had been waiting for this moment with an intensity that went beyond military preparation. Aristodemus had been enduring his living death for nearly a year, 12 months, give or take, of invisibility, of fire withheld, and words unsaid, and a name spoken always with that second word attached to it, like an anchor. A year of walking through a city that looked through him, of sitting at the edges of a society that had decided he did not fully exist. And now, there was going to be a battle. Not just any battle. A battle so large against an enemy so committed, with stakes so total that it would make Thermopylae look like a skirmish in terms of geopolitical consequence. A battle in which Sparta would field its full army, its best men, under its most capable commanders. A battle in which every Spartan warrior would have the chance to perform the act that justified every year of suffering in the ago, every cold night on the rushes, every meal stolen, and every beating endured. Kalos Thanatos, the beautiful death. Aristodemus could feel it coming, the way you feel a storm before it arrives, in the pressure of the air, in something shifting in the quality of the light. And he understood, with the clarity that a year of unrelenting shame tends to produce, exactly what he was going to do when it arrived. He was not going to fight for Sparta. He was not going to fight for Greece. He was not going to fight for honor or freedom or any of the elevated abstractions that generals put in their speeches before battles. He was going to fight for the right to be buried as a man. He was going to fight for the 6 words he wanted on whatever stone marked his grave. He was not a trembler. He was going to fight his way out of this world, or he was going to fight his way back into it. Either way, the trembling was done. The summer of 479 BC found the Greek world in a state of furious, barely controlled motion. Mardonius had spent the winter well. He'd established himself in Thessaly with a well-supplied, battle-hardened army, and had spent the cold months doing what good generals do between fighting seasons: politics. He sent feelers to Athens through the Macedonian king Alexander I. Not the great one, that's 2 centuries later, but an Alexander nonetheless, offering generous terms. Keep your freedom, keep your laws, get your city back, join us. The Athenians, already displaced, their city burned, their old life reduced to ash and memory, actually debated it seriously. They were exhausted. They were homeless. The offer wasn't nothing. but they said no, emphatically, almost angrily, no. And when Spartan ambassadors showed up, trying to make sure Athens didn't flip, the Athenians delivered one of the great speeches of the ancient world, preserved in Herodotus, explaining that as long as the sun followed its present course through the sky, they would never make terms with Xerxes. They were, they said, bound to the Greeks by shared blood, shared language, shared shrines and sacrifices, shared customs. You cannot buy that. You cannot burn it down. Mardonius got the message and marched south again in the spring. He occupied Athens for the second time, the evacuated empty shell of it, and sent one more offer of peace. The Athenian council was meeting on the island of Salamis, and when one member named Lycidas suggested they consider the Persian terms, the other council members stoned him to death on the spot. Then the Athenian women went to Lycidas's house and stoned his wife and children for good measure. That is the level of commitment we are dealing with. The Greeks rallied. The Spartan regent Pausanias, nephew of Leonidas, commanding the Spartan forces in place of the young king Pleistauchus, who was too young to lead an army, assembled the Greek alliance and marched north. The Athenians crossed back to the mainland and joined the force. In total, the Greek army that assembled on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, looking north toward the Boeotian plain where Mardonius was waiting, numbered somewhere between 38 and 40,000 heavily armed hoplites. Supported by light troops and a substantial number of helots, the Spartan contingent alone was 5,000 full Spartiates, the citizen warrior class, plus 30 pounds 5,000 helot warriors serving as light infantry, and 5,000 perioikoi, the free non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia, who fought alongside but not within the Spartan ranks. It was the largest Spartan army ever fielded up to that point. Pausanias was 20-something years old and commanding the most consequential military operation his city had ever attempted. And in that Spartan formation, somewhere in the ranks stood Aristodemus. We don't know precisely where he was assigned or what his status was within the army during the march north. The Atimia technically should have barred him from full participation in civic life, but Sparta was pragmatic above all else. You don't leave trained warriors at home when you're about to fight the battle of the century. He marched. He carried his shield. His companions still, almost certainly, maintained the invisible wall of social exclusion around him, even within the army itself. You can enforce social death even on a march. Men who have trained together since childhood know 100 ways to make someone feel non-existent without a word being spoken. But something was different now. There was purpose in the march. The destination was real. The enemy was real. And for Aristodemus, somewhere in the grinding miles between Sparta and the Boeotian plain, the grief and the shame and the year of walking dead existence had been transmuted into something new, something colder, something that had stopped resembling ordinary human emotion and started resembling a kind of engine. He had made his decision. He was going to do something at the coming battle that nobody could argue with, qualify, or explain away with medical excuses. He was going to perform an act of such singular, undeniable violence that every man who watched it would be forced to render a verdict. He would give them the evidence and let them judge. If he survived, they would have to call him brave. If he died, and the whole point was to make death something he ran toward rather than away from, he would die in a way that gave him back what Thermopylae had taken. This is the psychology of a man who has fought his way to the very bottom of a problem, and found, in the sediment at the bottom, one hard, clear solution. It is also, and I want to be precise about this, the psychology of someone in profound psychological crisis. What Aristodemus was planning was not a rational military strategy. It was not even, exactly, a survival strategy. It was a performance of self-annihilation executed in public for an audience, the culmination of a year's worth of the kind of pain that reshapes a person at the cellular level. The bravery it would require was real. The skill it would require was real. But the motivation was something we would recognize today as a textbook expression of trauma channeled into reckless self-endangerment. The ancient Greeks didn't have that framework. They had Aristeia, the individual warrior's moment of supreme battlefield excellence, the Homeric tradition of the hero who breaks above the ordinary tide of combat and achieves something singular. Achilles had his Aristeia, Diomedes had his Aristeia, Aristodemus, standing on the eve of the largest land battle of the Persian wars, was calculating his. Now let's talk about the battlefield itself, because the setting matters enormously to what's about to happen. Plataea sits in the foothills of Cithaeron, where the mountains slope down into the flat agricultural plain of Boeotia. The terrain is cut through by rivers, the Asopus running roughly east-west, and broken by low ridges and gullies that would prove absolutely decisive in the days of maneuvering before the main battle. This wasn't a clash that happened in an afternoon. The positioning and repositioning of both armies, the supply problems, the failed cavalry raids, the nights of anxious conference, it went on for weeks. Mardonius had cavalry. This was a serious problem for the Greeks. Persian cavalry under a commander named Mecistius was excellent, disciplined, aggressive, capable of disrupting supply lines and threatening exposed formations in ways that the Greeks, who relied on the phalanx and had relatively limited cavalry of their own, found extremely difficult to deal with. Early in the campaign, Persian horsemen managed to locate and destroy the Greeks' main water supply, a spring called Gargaphia, which forced Pausanias to order a nighttime repositioning. A maneuver that, executed in darkness with a large army of allied contingents who all had different commanders and communication protocols, went about as badly as you'd expect. The Greek line ended up scattered and disorganized across the slope, with gaps open in between contingents that Mardonius, watching from the plain at dawn, recognized immediately as an opportunity. He sent his cavalry and then his infantry forward. The Greeks were still sorting themselves out when the attack came. Pausanias's Spartans, anchoring the right wing, found themselves engaged before they'd finished repositioning. The Athenians on the left were in a separate engagement against the Greek allies fighting for Persia, primarily Theban-led Boeotians. A fact the Athenians would hold against Thebes for a generation. The center was chaos. For Aristodemus, the chaos was the point. The hoplite phalanx was a machine. That is not a metaphor. It was literally a mechanical system with specific inputs and outputs. 8 or more ranks of men, each carrying a large round shield on their left arm and a spear in their right hand, standing close enough to overlap shields. Advancing in lockstep at a pace set by pipes and rhythm, the front rank's job was to push and stab. The second rank's job was to push the first rank and stab over their shoulders. The third rank pushed the second. All the way back, the whole thing operated on the principle of collective mass and coordinated pressure. The phalanx that maintained its integrity longest generally won, because when one side began to break, the collapse accelerated rapidly. A gap in the line became a breach became a rout became a massacre. The absolute imperative of the phalanx was, hold the line, stay in formation, do not break ranks. Your individual survival is irrelevant. The machine is what matters, and Spartan warriors, more than anyone else in the Greek world, had this ground into them at a cellular level. They had been trained since childhood to function as components of this machine, to subordinate individual impulse to collective discipline. The phalanx was, in a sense, the physical manifestation of everything Sparta stood for: the group over the individual, the collective over the self. Aristodemus broke ranks. Let's be precise about what it means to break ranks in a hoplite battle, because it's not quite what it sounds like to modern ears. He didn't run away, he ran forward. What Aristodemus did, what Herodotus records, with the slightly puzzled admiration of a man watching something he can't quite categorize, was step out of the Spartan line and go into the Persian infantry alone. Not in a moment of disorientation or panic, not by accident. He left the formation deliberately, with what witnesses apparently described as something close to ecstasy, and went looking for the thickest part of the fighting, the way another man might walk toward light. Now, warrior culture has a concept for this. The Norse called it berserker, the bear shirt, the fighter who enters a state of combat trance in which normal pain responses are suppressed, fear disappears, and the body operates on pure, explosive violence at the expense of everything that makes tactical sense. We know now that this state has a neurochemical basis. Massive dumps of adrenaline and other stress hormones can produce exactly the described effects: tunnel vision, pain suppression, extraordinary strength and aggression, and a kind of dissociative calm in which death stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a door. Aristodemus had been walking toward that door for a year. He knew where it was. He was ready. The Persian infantry that faced the Spartan right wing at Plataea was not composed of the lightly armored archers that Greek propaganda sometimes made them out to be. Mardonius had the best of what was left of Xerxes' army. His infantry included Persian nationals, the core of the force, as well as Median soldiers, Bactrians, and others, all fighting in their own styles with their own weapons. The Persians typically carried a large wicker shield covered in leather or hide, a short spear, a bow, and a short sword or long dagger called an echinokes. They were capable fighters. They were not, however, equipped or trained to stand in a sustained pushing contest against bronze-armored Greek hoplites. And Mardonius knew this, which was why he'd spent so much energy trying to fight on terms that suited his cavalry and archers, rather than letting it come down to a straight infantry engagement. But it had come down to that, and now there was a Spartan outside the Spartan line. Imagine you are a Persian soldier in that front rank. The Greek phalanx is in front of you. A wall of shields moving forward with the grinding, inexorable pressure of 8 ranks of men pushing behind it, the clash of bronze on bronze and wood so loud it physically hurts. The screaming of wounded men, the stink of blood and fear sweat and opened bowels. This is the worst experience a human being can have. You are already dealing with that. And then something comes out of the Greek line that isn't behaving like the Greek line. No formation around it, no shield wall to its left or right. Just a man, a big man by Spartan standards, trained since childhood to be an instrument of physical destruction, coming at you and your companions with the weapon held in a way that suggests he is not particularly interested in being defended. His shield is a weapon as much as a protection. He is using it to bash men aside rather than to shelter behind. His spear is thrusting in wide, rapid arcs. He is not fighting to hold a line. He is fighting to go deeper, to get further in, to find more of you. The Persian front rank would have tried to close around him, The instinct is to surround an isolated enemy, to cut off retreat, to mass weapons on a single target until it goes down. But Aristodemus wasn't looking to retreat. Surrounding him was doing him a favor. He wanted to be surrounded. He wanted more enemies, not fewer. The men who tried to encircle him found themselves being pushed into each other's space by a man who was moving constantly, spending no energy on protection and every ounce of it on aggression. Herodotus tells us that Aristodemus performed great deeds at Plataea. The understatement is almost funny. What he is describing, reading between the careful lines of a historian who doesn't quite have the vocabulary for what he witnessed, is a man killing with a systematic, almost joyful relentlessness that stood out even against the background of what was in total one of the bloodiest days in ancient Greek history, because the rest of the battle was also going decisively. Pausanias, commanding the Spartan right, had engaged the Persian infantry proper, the core of Mardonius's force. After a frustrating period in which his men had stood under a barrage of Persian arrows, shields held overhead, waiting for the omens from the sacrifice to be favorable. Yes, you read that right. The Spartans were being showered with arrows, and men were dying, and Pausanias was praying and waiting for the entrails of a sacrificed animal to show the right signs before he gave the order to advance. This was not timidity. This was religion taken with absolute seriousness, the understanding that you do not go into battle without divine favor, no matter how urgent the tactical situation. The men stood there and bled, and held their shields, and waited. When the sign came, they advanced. And when Spartans advanced in full formation, with the pipes playing and the line dressed, and 8 ranks of the most intensively trained infantry in the world moving together, it was, by all accounts from both sides, an experience that defied ordinary description. The Persian front crumbled under the pressure. The wicker shields were not built for this. The short spears could not reach over the Greek shields before the Greek spears reached the Persian flesh behind them. Mardonius himself was in the fighting. He was that kind of general, the man who led from the front on a white horse, surrounded by a picked bodyguard of the best Persian infantry. He fought until he was killed, reportedly by a Spartan named Amnestus, and when he fell, the Persian army fell with him. The loss of the commander transformed an already difficult situation into a catastrophe. The Persian infantry that had held together through discipline and loyalty to Mardonius lost the organizing principle of their resistance in an instant. They ran for their fortified camp, a palisaded enclosure on the Asopus, and the Greeks pursued. The slaughter in the pursuit was immense. Ancient battles were often won or lost in this phase. The rout, when organized resistance collapsed and men running for their lives were cut down from behind by men who were no longer thinking about tactics, only about killing. The Greeks crashed through the Persian camp's defenses. The Athenians on the left had dealt with the Boeotian Greeks fighting for Persia and came to join the assault on the camp. The fighting inside the palisade was close and brutal. Hand to hand in narrow spaces between tents and supply wagons and terrified men looking for somewhere to hide. The Persians who survived the camp's breach ran. A small force of 40,000 managed to escape north with a commander named Artabazus, who had kept his unit back from the main engagement and exercised the tactical judgment to recognize that the battle was lost before it was lost. He marched them back to Asia and survived. Everyone else, the tens of thousands who stayed, who fought, who ran and were caught, was dead by nightfall. It was, by any measure, one of the most decisive military victories in Western history. The Persian invasion was over. Not weakened, not repelled temporarily, over. Mardonius was dead. His army was destroyed. Xerxes' ambition to add Greece to the empire died on the Boeotian plain that afternoon, and it never revived. The Greek city-states would remain independent. The experiment in self-governance they were conducting, the democratic institutions in Athens, the fierce republican independence of Sparta, the chaotic, argumentative, glorious mess of the Greek political system would continue, would develop, would eventually produce philosophy and drama and science and all the rest of it in forms that still shape the world we live in today. All of that is true. All of that was happening on that plain. And in the middle of all of it, Aristodemus was still fighting. Let's talk about the human body in a hoplite battle, because I think we sometimes aestheticize ancient warfare into something cleaner than it was. The aspis, the large round hoplite shield, weighed roughly 15 to 17 pounds on its own. Full bronze armor, if you were lucky enough to have a full panoply, added another 40 to 60 pounds to that. You were fighting in heat that could reach 35 degrees Celsius on a Boeotian summer afternoon, in armor that reflected and retained heat, while performing one of the most physically demanding activities a human body can be asked to perform. The pushing contest of the phalanx engagement, the othismos, the shoving match, required every muscle in the legs and back, the kind of total body exertion that elite athletes train for years to sustain for minutes. You were also simultaneously trying not to be stabbed. The spear was the primary weapon, but once spears shattered, and they did constantly, it was short swords, and when swords broke or were lost, it was whatever you could grab. Ancient battle accounts mention men fighting with shields used as clubs, with broken spear hafts, with bare hands in the tightest press. The noise was overwhelming. The screaming, the clash of weapons, the percussion of shield on shield, loud enough to cause hearing damage and to make spoken orders functionally impossible. Which is why the pipes played, why the battle cry was chanted in unison, why Spartan armies moved to music. Aristodemus fought through all of this without the shield wall at his shoulder, without the spear tips of the second rank covering his head, without the collective discipline of the machine that was making his companions effective. He was fighting on pure physical capacity and absolute disregard for consequences. Every trained fighter knows that the disregard for consequences is a force multiplier. It is terrifying to fight someone who doesn't seem to care if they get hurt, because every tactical response you have is built on the assumption that the other person wants to live. Remove that assumption, and your model breaks. Men avoided him, or tried to, or got caught trying. The Persians who came into his immediate vicinity were facing something that their experience of Greek warfare had not prepared them for. They had fought hoplites before. They knew the phalanx. They'd learned by this point in the war how to probe its edges, how to find the seams between units, how to use cavalry and missiles to disrupt the formation before the infantry closed. They had no protocol for this. Herodotus, in one of his most telling observations, notes that when the Spartans later discussed who had fought best among their number at Plataea, a man named Posidonius was ranked among the finest because he had fought bravely and survived. But Aristodemus, who had also fought with extraordinary distinction, was specifically denied the award for valor, the Aristeia, because he had, the judges determined, fought in a frenzy rather than fighting well. He had sought death rather than victory, and this is where the story twists into something philosophically exquisite and painful. The Spartan decision about Aristodemus is one of the most remarkable verdicts in ancient military history, and the more you sit with it, the more layers it reveals. Let's state it plainly. After the Battle of Plataea, with the Persian army destroyed and the Greek world preserved, and the military commanders surveying what had been achieved and by whom, the Spartan leadership gathered to render judgment on individual acts of valor. These things mattered. The Aristeia was not just a title, it was the formal communal recognition of what a man had done, the official version of his combat record that would follow his name and his descendants forever. It was, in a culture that ran on reputation as its primary currency, about as consequential as any honor could be. Aristodemus had, by any objective measurement, been the most ferociously effective individual fighter on the Greek side. He had left the Spartan line and plunged into the Persian infantry alone and come back alive. A thing that should have been impossible. A thing that required a combination of skill, strength, and absolute mental commitment that almost defied categorization. He had killed. Significantly, the men who saw it were not confused about what they had witnessed. They were awed, and the judges denied him the award. Their reasoning, as Herodotus records it, Aristodemus had broken ranks. He had fought madly, out of himself, in a frenzy. Lyssa, the word Herodotus uses, which carries connotations of divine madness, of rabies, of something beyond rational control. He had not fought as a Spartan should fight, in formation, in discipline, as a component of the collective machine. More damningly, they said he had desired to die. He had fought with reckless, suicidal abandon, not because he was trying to win, but because he was trying to be erased. And Sparta, that most martial of cultures, drew a precise and carefully considered line between dying bravely and dying desperately. Posidonius, who had also fought with great distinction and had survived and had evidently done so while maintaining the discipline and formation that Spartan doctrine required, was praised. His bravery was clean. It was in service of the collective. It was the right kind of bravery. Aristodemus's bravery was contaminated. It was in service of himself, of his personal psychological need. His fight had not been a sacrifice for Sparta. It had been a transaction he was trying to execute with the universe. My death for my reputation. And Sparta, even in acknowledging the extraordinary nature of what he'd done, refused to complete the transaction on those terms. There is something almost unbearably cruel about this, and something almost unbearably correct about it, and the tension between those two things is what makes the story of Aristodemus so enduring. Cruel first. The man had suffered a year of social death for a choice that was, at minimum, defensible. He had been sick. Leonidas himself had sent him away. The illness was real. His shame, whatever its moral justification, had been total and genuine, and had clearly been destroying him at a psychological level that modern observers can recognize as trauma, even if ancient Spartans didn't have the framework. He had gone to Plataea and done something extraordinary under that weight, had transmuted shame into action in the most physically demanding way imaginable. And the response of his society was, yes, but you were trying to die. Yes, but you broke formation. Yes, but the motive wasn't pure. We see what you did. We cannot deny it. But the highest honor that we will not give you. There is a particular kind of institutional coldness to this judgment that suggests why Sparta, for all its extraordinary achievements, was ultimately a civilization that consumed itself. A culture so precise in its definitions of acceptable courage that it could look at a man who had just killed his way through a Persian army alone and find him wanting had developed a purity spiral from which there was ultimately no escape. The bar for honor kept being defined more narrowly, the terms of the kalos thanatos kept being refined, until eventually the Spartan citizen class, the Spartiates, the fully enfranchised warriors, dwindled from thousands to hundreds because the system's requirements were, in the long run, incompatible with the survival of the people who tried to meet them, but correct, too, because the Spartan judges were not wrong about what Aristodemus had been doing. He had not been fighting for Sparta. He had been fighting for Aristodemus. The distinction is real, even if the line is fine, even if we feel sympathy for the man standing on the wrong side of it. A warrior who fights in order to die is a different military asset than a warrior who fights in order to win. And Sparta was, above all things, a culture organized around military effectiveness. They could honor the extraordinary physical courage. They could not pretend that it was the right kind of courage for the purposes they were built around. And yet Herodotus tells us something interesting. He notes that after the battle, as the Greeks were distributing the spoils and the formal judgments were being rendered, Aristodemus was mentioned. His name was in the conversation. The judges knew who he was and what he'd done. He was not invisible anymore. He was not a ghost. He was a man about whom the most important people in Sparta were making specific, considered pronouncements, even if those pronouncements fell short of the highest possible honor. For a man who had been refused fire, for a man who had been talked through rather than talked to, for a man who had answered to Tressas for 12 months. Being argued about was a form of restoration. Being seen was a form of restoration. The verdict stung, undoubtedly, but the verdict acknowledged his existence in a way that the silence of the previous year had not. Did it wash away the stain? This is the question I keep returning to, and I think the most honest answer is, we don't know, and the uncertainty is the point. We don't know if Aristodemus survived Plataea. Herodotus doesn't tell us explicitly. The man tears into the Persian line with the explicit goal of dying there, and the account of the battle doesn't give us a clear resolution to his personal story. He may have gotten the death he was seeking and found in it whatever peace he was looking for. He may have survived, again, impossibly, improbably, and walked home from Plataea the way he'd walked home from Thermopylae, alive when he hadn't planned to be, carrying a new story that was still not quite the story he needed. If he survived, what did he find? The Atimia, was it lifted? Herodotus doesn't say. The logic of the system would suggest that his remarkable performance in battle should have restored him to some degree of standing, even if the formal award for valor was denied. The community that had refused to acknowledge him for a year had now been given incontrovertible evidence that whatever had happened at Thermopylae, it was not a reflection of the man's fundamental character. He had proven himself. But systems are slow. Communities are slow. The neighbor who refused to give you fire last autumn doesn't easily transform into the neighbor who clasps your arm in the market and calls you by your given name. The label Tressa had been applied to Aristodemus with the full weight of Spartan social consensus. Removing it required that same consensus to reconstitute itself around a new assessment. And consensus, as any community knows, is a slow, conservative thing. It moves when it moves. What we can say with confidence is that Aristodemus achieved something at Plataea that was, in the narrow terms of his impossible situation, the best available outcome. He was seen. He was recognized. His name was in the mouth of the people who decided what names meant in Sparta. Whether or not they gave him the formal garland, whether or not the neighbors warmed again, or the conversations resumed, or the fire was shared, he had made it impossible to call him a Trembler with the same conviction, the same completeness, that they'd called him one before. He had created ambiguity, and in a world that had been dealing him pure condemnation, ambiguity was a form of victory. So what do we do with the story of Aristodemus? Because it is easy to tell it as a simple redemption arc. Man falls, man rises, man proves himself, end of story. And that telling is emotionally satisfying and not without truth. There was something real in what he achieved at Plataea, something that deserved recognition even in the inadequate form it received. But the more honest telling is harder and more interesting. Aristodemus' story is about the price of survival in a culture that has decided survival is shameful. It is about what happens to a person when the community that gave them identity and purpose turns that identity and purpose against them, when the system that was supposed to produce warriors produces, instead, a walking wound. It is about how trauma doesn't make people noble. It makes them desperate. And sometimes desperation looks like heroism from the outside, and sometimes it is heroism. And the line between those things is not a line that philosophers have satisfactorily drawn in 2,500 years of trying. It is also about the limits of what an individual can do against an institutional verdict. Aristodemus could not fight his way to a clean conscience, because a clean conscience was not the Spartan system's job to provide. The system was built to produce a specific kind of soldier, not to tend to the psychological well-being of the men it produced. It used shame as a mechanism and accepted the collateral damage of that mechanism as an operational cost. Aristodemus was collateral damage who refused to stay collapsed, who dragged himself back to his feet and aimed himself at the nearest available target, which happened to be the Persian Empire, and did something remarkable with his damage. He did not find peace. He may have found something. He found recognition, which is not the same thing as peace, but which is perhaps the most a man in his position could realistically seek. And there is something in that, in the gap between what we seek and what we can actually get, between the clean resolution we want for our suffering and the messy, ambiguous, partial resolutions that life actually provides, that rings true in a way that transcends the ancient Boeotian plain and the world of bronze shields and mountain passes and kings with thrones on hillsides. Survivor's guilt is not a solved problem. The human need for belonging, the desperate animal need to be inside the warmth of the community rather than outside it in the cold, is not a solved problem. The question of how much a person owes to the group they belong to versus how much they are permitted to owe to their own continued existence is not a solved problem. We still argue about it. We still make terrible calculations on its terms. And when we fail those calculations, when we survive something we weren't supposed to survive, or when we make a choice that our community decides was the wrong choice, when we find ourselves on the outside of the warmth looking in, we still sometimes do what Aristodemus did. We look for the battle. We look for the moment when we can turn the desperation into something that looks enough like courage to spend. Whether it works is a different question. Whether it's enough is always a different question. The stone at Thermopylae, the one with Simonides' epitaph on it, stood for centuries, long after the Persian War, long after Sparta itself had fallen from power, long after the Athenian experiment in democracy had collapsed and been revived and transformed beyond recognition. That stone stood. Go tell the Spartans. Aristodemus' name does not appear on that stone. He was there. He trained beside those men. He ate with them and bled beside them and was sent away by the king who chose who would die and who would carry messages. His name is not on the stone, but Herodotus wrote it down. In the histories, the first great work of prose narrative in the Western tradition, the founding document of what we now call history, Herodotus told the story of a man called Aristodemus the Trembler, who survived Thermopylae and fought at Plataea with a ferocity beyond accounting, and was denied the highest honor by men who recognized that his bravery, and the right kind of bravery, were not quite the same thing. He wrote it down. The name survived. Maybe that's enough. Maybe for a man who spent a year as a ghost, being written down, being real, being permanent, being part of the record, is its own kind of kalos thanatos. Not the death in battle he might have sought, not the redemption the system withheld, but something, a persistence, a presence in the story. Aristodemus the Trembler, who trembled once and never again. We remember him.